a no-go on the PowerPoint?
Could be.
Okay.
I heard it,
All right, that's not a no-go on the speech. If you guys don't mind my doing this little song and dance and a few things, that'll be fine. And I'll try and follow, be flipping through my PowerPoint hard copy presentation, rocking it old school, right? Be prepared, as they say in Boy Scouts. Be prepared. Okay. Whew, this is going to throw off my timing a little bit. Sorry. Phil, are we thinking it's going to be a no-go on the PowerPoint?
yeah.
I don't know. Phil, are you okay if someone gives you a hand?
Sure.
All right.
Maybe somebody.
For the record, I'm Phil, that's Paul.
Okay. At our Lancaster Township Historical Society, I have two people whose names are Deb Franz.
Oh my goodness. Really?
That gets kind of crazy, but they're both dear, sweet people, highly involved. But I apologize to both Phil, Paul, and any other Phils or Pauls we have in the room. All right. So, Canal Engineering. This is great that y'all showed up. This topic might not sound terribly exciting, but it really, really is to think about what happened here in Pennsylvania and in other areas of the country. In the early 1800s, a massive infrastructure improvement took place, not just here in Pennsylvania, but throughout the United States. And it created a transportation improvement between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. That's about 400 miles of canal being built just between those two cities. And then there were also connecting streams that were improved to provide transportation. Now, we'll be focusing on what happened, why, where it happened, and who were the people involved, what did they do. Now, one of the biggest, I'm just going to highlight a couple of places where these took place. We'll be focusing on them a little bit more. One was the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. We'll be talking about that a little bit. Then the Conestoga navigation. You've seen some displays here, and Don and I presented on that in the past. Then also the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal. Julie, where are you? Julie's here from the Lockhouse Museum down at Havre de Grace. They have a great display there about the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal. And then also the Portage Railroad, which was this bizarre improvement to haul canal boats over the Allegheny Mountains. So, yeah, the first time you grasp it, it takes your breath away. And there's this marvelous national museum there. You get a national park museum. You can go and check it out, walk the whole site. It's really, really quite amazing. Now, canals they take shape in several different ways for different people, in different locations. One of the primary things to keep in mind is a lock. A lock typically is a way of raising or lowering a boat. So to do that in a canal, you're using water that's been artificially designated to an area, and that the lock has gates both upstream and lower, below the chamber of the lock. And those are opened or closed to allow a boat to go in. But then, if you think about it, the water would be flowing in, it would raise that water up, then that would seal that lower gate closed, right? Actually, it's Leonardo da Vinci who came up with the first miter lock configuration. So the way that you would then draw the water out is there were paddles at the bottom that would open up holes in the bottom of the lock gate, and there were bars at the top that you could turn to open up the paddles at the bottom to allow water to flow out or to flow in. So you would open the gate, you would go in, close the gate, then they would open the paddles at the upper level, the water would flow in, the water would rise, And then you would be able to easily open the gates at the upper end, and you could continue on. Reverse direction, you're coming downstream. You would open the gates, come in, close the upper gates. At the lower gates, you would turn those paddles there to open and drain the water out. The water would go down. You would open those lower gates and then continue on. Now, one of our favorite thoughts about canal boats are mules, the mule teams that were there. The mules were generally providing all the power to move the canal boats. In later years then, there was self-propelled steam tugs or steam boats that would actually use some of these canals as well. So the lock is a fundamental part of every canal that's out there. And there's this marvelous operational model, just stunning model, down at the Lock House Museum down in Havre Grace. And you can go there and you can see all these things open and close, and the water drains, and this little boat goes in, it goes up or down. They even have some model mules that sort of pull the thing along. It's just marvelous. So I commend you to check out the Lock House Museum down in Havre Grace. Also, the channel was yes.
How many boats could go through at a time?
It depended on the configuration of the lock, but they were generally many of the canal boats would travel in tandem. So one or two would come along, and depending on how the lock was built, it could either lift one or it could lift two if they built it large enough. But if you can imagine, building a longer lock would be far more expensive, but it would increase the capacity. You're absolutely right. Some of the locks were built with special protection because they were at tide water, or they were like along the Susquehanna River. There were locks that were built to allow water to flow into the canal. So sometimes there were different configurations, but the locks all fundamentally worked the same way. They allowed water to flow in and raise, or to drain out in order to gain that elevation difference. The towpath was also a fundamental thing, so that the mules could pull you in one direction or another. And I believe you're going to hear more from a canal musician coming up in October. Is that right?
That is...
the fellow who didn't show up the last time. But, anyway, I look forward to seeing that program. I'm glad I didn't miss it.
October 8th, Matt Dodd, Songs and Stories of the Old Canal Days.
Yeah, so I look forward to attending that program. So you're creating an artificial waterway, and you still have roads that need to get over it. You still have, at every lock, you need to be able to get from one side to another without jumping across this thing. So there were bridges everywhere along the canal, all the canals. There were bridges that would go from one side to the other. Some of them were pivot bridges. There's an actual working pivot bridge down at the Lock House Museum in Havre Grace. There were also simple arch bridges. There were stone bridges. There were covered bridges that would allow you to go over top of the canal. But sometimes the canal itself had to go over top of something. So they would create aqueducts. An aqueduct has all this water sitting in it. So it's extremely heavy. And bridges are one of the sexiest things that civil engineers do. So this bridge, having all this water in it, is always just sitting there waiting for a canal boat to come along. So there are still stone aqueducts that are in existence that you can go and see. Lock House Museum has a model of a stone aqueduct. These are amazing things that were built back in the day. Also tunnels. Now, in the 1800s, tunnels, they didn't have these big boring machines like Elon Musk created. They had to send guys in there and blast and haul stuff out, and people were killed. Oh my gosh. All right. My life has changed. All right, let me cycle through. I'm so excited now. All right, I'm not going to start over, but hopefully this is the one. Oh, there we go, okay. There's the Lockhouse Museum channel, the channel's the towpath. I can't stop. All right, the aqueducts, there's the model, here we are, okay. I gotta slow down, okay, slow down. All right, so that's all we gotta cover. I want to stay sensitive to time. All right, so here's this tunnel. I love this picture, can't wait for it. All right, so this tunnel, as you can see, is part of the abandoned Union Canal near Lebanon, PA.
Not abandoned.
It still exists. You can go there and look at it. Now, what's missing from this section of this canal?
Towpath.
Yes! All right, so how do you get a barge through a tunnel? Anybody?
They would,
Push it. How do you push it?
with their feet up against the tunnel.
With your feet up against it. Very good. All right. Experts in the house. I hope I don't say anything wrong. All right, so but you can go. There's a park up there in Lebanon. You can go and check this out. So I encourage you to do that. All right. Now, hydrology and hydraulics. Nobody freak out. I'm not going to get into calculations, but this is from one of the plan and profile sheets from the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal. And you can see the canal is right here. Just above it is the towpath. This is the Susquehanna River. But then there's this creek that comes in, and it's feeding water into the canal, because all along the canal, you're going to have different variances in elevation. Sometimes the water's going to have to spill out. Sometimes you're bringing more water in. And then also the canal itself, the bed, the channel, is going to be infiltrating water. It's going to be leaking out everywhere. It was a messy, messy situation. They used clay that they lined on the inside of the canal. They called it mudding. You know, really, really great name. But these feeders were very important. And when there was too much water, they built waste weirs to allow water to go out, because you didn't want the water just spilling out over the towpath. If you had that, then it would wear away the towpath. So they had these specific spots where they designed the amount of water coming in and where it was going out. Then you had water that would come in and you didn't even want it to get in. You didn't want it to do anything but just get to where it always had been. So this is a culvert underneath the canal. Oh no! What happened? You didn't touch it, right? Okay, so then culverts, back to the old school. All right, then culverts were a way of draining water underneath the canal. Oh man, then there's this beautiful picture of this mule team. Sorry.
Can you hold it up?
What's
Can you
that?
hold it up?
I can. It's not going to be very impressive.
Sure.
But the boats themselves, someone was asking about the boats and how many were pulled along at a single time. Generally, the boats dimensionally, I had the notes here. Yeah. So the canal boats were generally 65 feet long, 16 feet wide, and about 8 feet deep. And that was, then they would have a 5-foot draft when the boat was fully loaded. So that told you what the dimensions for the canal channel needed to be, and the locks. Big problem they had when they built the Union Canal between Schuylkill River and Susquehanna River is they built the locks too small, too narrow, so you couldn't bring the boats through. So it was a completely botched situation. And that's why you hear very little about the Union Canal. Ultimately, then the Pennsylvania Railroad went through and provided transportation from Philadelphia to Columbia. The cargo on these things, typically you would have. Did you have a question with us?
On a side note, when we were talking about the Union Canal, I went last year to Union Canal Days, and the children would actually use poles to push them through the actual canal. They will wait and go up around the towpath and then come around the other side.
And help to push it, yeah.
Yep.
So the cargo on the canal boats, it was basically whatever needed to be moved that was valuable enough to pay the freight, if you will. So you'd have iron ore, you'd have various types of other minerals, you would have lumber sometimes was being transported, agricultural goods, and then sometimes there were passengers, people who would be taking a canal boat ride, either just recreationally or just literally getting from one place to another. Charles Dickens came through and took the canal boat trip from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia to Pittsburgh and went over the Portage Railroad. Yes, ma'am?
Didn't they have families that actually lived on these boats?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the crew, that's correct. The people who were manning the boats, they would live there long term. They would travel with their own boat, as well as the mule team. There was frequently a stable on the canal boat to house the mule team. I read an interesting note that one of the canal boats was used as literally a department store, where they would sell goods directly out of it, which sounded pretty interesting, where it would come into town, it would sell its goods, and then move on its way. Well, the people who had their own store in that town, they were very upset when this new vendor would come in. Okay, so the next part I wanted to get into had to do with why these were built. And transportation, as you might imagine, in colonial times was very difficult. There were really terrible roads that were nothing more than mud paths through the forest. There were, of course, wagons and so forth, but this involved a lot of time delays, breakage, and then there was this almost, it's hard for us to realize what the impetus was when the westward expansion occurred, when the 1787 Treaty of Paris created what was called the Northwest Territories with Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois, opened up the Ohio Valley, if you will, and then the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. So there was this incredible urge to move west, away from the eastern seaboard. And one of the other impetus for the canals was to improve transportation and to improve communication. Now we got to realize that printing back then in the colonial era, that was still relatively new for humanity. So we had printing presses, but not a lot of them. So exchange of knowledge and exchange of information was always dependent on transportation, being able to get a physical document or a person to somewhere else. Hazards Register of Pennsylvania is a unique document. In 1828 to 1836, it was a compendium of knowledge and information of newspapers to be able to get the word out to people of what was going on in the world. It wasn't until 1846 that the telegraph actually debuted here in Lancaster. So if you think about it, all the information flow was dependent on transportation, not just commerce, but just information as well. So we really needed to be able to communicate with each other. The canals also created a very early opportunity for a real shift in how we invested in projects, invested in companies. Prior to the canal era, typically you would have sole proprietors or partners, where people would get together, they would form a company. But then in the early part of the 1800s, we started to see lotteries to create capital to do a project, and then shareholders to purchase shares. And these canals, they required a huge amount of money to put together. The government stepped in and they started investing in some of these as well. But it was an enormous amount of money that was needed for these. Very little consideration of any financial fallout. 10 minutes to go? Thanks. Any concern about financial fallout. The cost of maintenance was frequently ignored with these projects. And then workers' wages and worker living conditions were low on the totem pole. This was horrible, horrible conditions for the workers. Almost no regard was given to the workers actually in the field. Now, we weren't doing this on our own. We didn't come up with the idea of canals. The earliest canal in the world was in China, the Grand Canal of China, in roughly 500 BC. It had 24 locks, 60 bridges, and a length of more than 1,100 miles. You know, the Chinese, we might not like everything they do, but man, they can put a lot of people on a team. They really can. The earliest European canal was 1177 in Italy, and then Netherlands and France started learning from that. The earliest canal in England was the Bridgewater Canal, and that was in the mid-1700s. One of the other famous canals in that part of the world was the Suez Canal, which didn't begin until the mid-1800s. And then it was the Panama Canal, probably the most famous canal in the world, that began in the late 1800s, 1881. But here in the U.S., the earliest canal was in 1792 in Connecticut, first one in Pennsylvania, 1797. So you see, we're starting to learn, we're starting to exchange, we're starting to share the information. And the 1797 was in Pennsylvania to circumvent the Conewago Falls along the Susquehanna River. Now, the Susquehanna River, aside from being a super old and really interesting river, has the unique problem of being unnavigable. There's a lot of rocky areas, but then there's some areas where it's 150 feet deep. So it's this incredible river that has a lot of flow going down it all the time. And then there was all this wonderful resources in Pennsylvania that we wanted to get to market. We had all these woods. Remember, Pennsylvania means Penn's Woods. This whole place was covered with old growth trees. And we wanted to hack them all down, good or bad. We wanted to hack them all down, chop them up into lumber, and send them down the river. Well, it was a lot easier to build rafts and arcs out of these things and to flow it down the Susquehanna River. And you would wait until the spring thaw happened where the water was higher. They called it freshets, the spring thaws. So the water would be higher, then you could get over some of the rocks. Sometimes dams were created in the Susquehanna to raise that water elevation and allow the rafts to flow over. But the first canal was created to allow that conveyance of lumber, essentially, around the Conewago Falls of the Susquehanna. Then the first canal in Maryland was the Susquehanna Canal, opened in 1802, but it was on the east side. It basically ran from Port Deposit down to the Tidewater. But it wasn't very successful, it didn't last very long, it's not terribly well known. Another important canal in Maryland was the Chesapeake and Ohio that opened in 1830, and that had a long run. That ran almost 100 years of operation. So that one did very well. Maybe we can take a quick break.
Question in the back there.
I have a question about weather on the canals. When there was bad weather, lots of rain, how did that impact the canals?
So the question was, how did bad weather impact the canals? That's why the waste weir was there, was to allow water to flow out. But in the winter time, they would often drain the canals bone dry. So there are pictures of canal barges just sitting in a dry trench, waiting for things to come back. So, yes, Ken?
One thing that always has amazed me is that for a period, I think about 40 years, Lancaster was listed as an inland port of the United States. If you had the time and the money, you could go down to South Prince Street to the District Inn or the Dirty Old Tavern, which was Stryker's Landing. There you could get a canal boat, go through 6 locks down to Conestoga to Safe Harbor.
That's correct. That's what Don and I did a presentation on, the Conestoga
Yeah.
navigation. And it was 9 locks initially.
Originally,
Yeah, and they changed it to 6. And we'll touch base on that a little bit later, as the Conestoga navigation,
And
that's
at
coming.
Safe Harbor, there was a crib dam across the
Okay.
Susquehanna.
That's correct.
You're back.
About where the dam is today. And the mules took the boat over to the York County side.
Correct.
On the York County side,
There was an inlet lock to get to the Susquehanna and Tidewater.
the Tidewater Canal.
That's right.
The Haverty Trace.
Yep,
And
yep.
the Haverty Trace, you transferred to a bay boat that went to Baltimore. And in Baltimore, you got a ocean-going boat that went down the Chesapeake to New York. So if you had the time and the
Curious
money,
about the
you
biggest
could leave Lancaster and go to New York all by boat.
And it was advertised you could take a steamboat passage from Lancaster to Paris, right? Didn't we see that, Don? As knucklehead of an idea that
I
is.
have never found out how much it cost totally, or how long it took
What, the
from go to Lancaster to New York.
oh, the passage, yeah, I haven't found that out either. I think it was more hooey than it was really an opportunity for, all right, we're almost back to where we're supposed to be. Okay, come on. Yep. Connecticut, PA, Maryland. All right, what's the one I'm missing? I haven't said it yet. Erie Canal, thank you, very good. The Erie Canal went from Albany to Buffalo. This was an incredible achievement. It was proposed right after the Revolutionary War. They started survey work in 1808. It was authorized in 1817 and opened just a few years later. The toll revenue completely covered the state's debt in the first year of operation.
Wow.
This blew everybody's minds, especially in Pennsylvania. We call it canal mania is really what happened. Now, as early as the 1600s, William Penn envisioned a canal connecting the Schuylkill to the Susquehanna. That's what became the Union Canal. Again, utter disaster, engineering failure, but slow down, right? George Washington was also part of this. George Washington, not also a general, president, he was also a surveyor. And while he was in the Alleghenies fighting the French and Indians, he was also surveying to try and figure out how do we get through these Allegheny Mountains. So he was looking for different transportation alternatives there. And very soon after the Revolutionary War, the PA legislature started issuing these charters, which basically gave permission. Yeah, go ahead and do that. Go ahead and do that. And they created these the PA Canal Commissioners. As I mentioned, the Susquehanna River was a real challenge that had to be resolved. There we go. Okay, so the Canal Commissioners, they were created in 1824. This is the beginning of the canal mania really in Pennsylvania. And they were tasked to find a canal route from the Great Valley of Chester and Lancaster counties along one or another set of natural waterways westward to Pittsburgh. So this is what prompted our Lancaster guys to go crazy with building the Conestoga navigation that Ken was referring to. Probably ill-advisedly doing that because the canal never made its way to Lancaster. But we were hoping for all that transportation to come through. Oh, no. Okay. All right. So, and then the following year, they were tasked to develop a navigable communication between the eastern and western waters of the state and to go all the way up to Lake Erie. And in 1826, that's the year the Erie Canal opened, they started work on the Main Line Canal. The Main Line Canal is run from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. And within just 20 years, they created this massive network. They achieved that route from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. They had northward extending canals up the Susquehanna, the Juniata, the Schuylkill was improved, the Susquehanna was improved, and it was this incredible project that was done. All right, so fast forward to the end. Why did these things stop existing? They, as I mentioned before, the maintenance costs just killed a bunch of these. They just couldn't keep up with the funding. The operating capital wasn't there. They weren't generating enough revenue to make them successful. Some of the shortcuts in design that led to their utter failure, the winter shutdowns, we talked about the seasonal obstacles, and then the railroads. The railroads just came in and it was much, much better. But in the early 1800s, railroads were essentially horse-drawn conveyances. So they didn't have the steam engine locomotives that we think of with railroads today. Those came later in the 1800s. So as I mentioned, these were built all across the eastern half of the United States.
You're up again, honey.
We're up again? Thank you.
Maybe.
No, I heard it just.
Nope, wrong way. Here we go, 1847. So this is the outline of our state, and you can see these darker lines are all of these canals that got built all the way through the Commonwealth. We talked about what caused these to come to an end. So this is a great map. Thank you, Don, again, for taking pictures of this map. This is a map of the lower Susquehanna, and that referring here to the east side of the Susquehanna, the earliest canal from Tidewater all the way up to Port Deposit. There's still some evidence of that. If you were to go, you might have to tromp out of your vehicle to go find some of what was once there. But then that Susquehanna Canal on the east side was not terribly successful, so they decided to do it again on the west side. And this was a project done both by Pennsylvania and by Maryland between 1836 and 1839. And it ran from Wrightsville to Havre de Grace. So this is a picture of the, in Havre de Grace, the Lock House Museum. This is this marvelous lock that's been preserved with the pivot bridge. And at the northern end, this is Wrightsville. So this is right along the western shore of the Susquehanna River. And if you were thinking about going and taking a look at it, there's not much there anymore, very little to see. But you really need to use your imagination to consider that. That's just south of Veterans Memorial Bridge. Yes, Ken?
When the power companies lower the water level on the Susquehanna along one level, you can see remnants of the canal in the mud.
Yeah, Jay's here? Jay Mackey? Yeah, there's Jay. Jay's got his Ramblers. They go out and check out all the waterside evidence of a lot of these features, the dams, the locks, the tow paths, and different things that can be seen when that water level is dropped, as you say, Ken, you're right. So the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal was pretty successful. It was 43 miles long. Ken appropriately pointed out one of the locations is called Long Level, because this is one of the long level spots in between locks. It's like, I think 4 or 5 miles long. That's a long way to go, because it was all dead flat. The canal itself was roughly 50 feet wide. It had 29 locks and created an elevation change of 231 feet. Now, when you're doing something like that, something that's 43 miles long, speaking of engineering, you're not going to have one crew working their way all the way down. Not if you're going to build it in a matter of 3 years. So there were crews, work sites, that were all along the way building this simultaneously. and they were they had different project managers, if you will, engineers of various levels that were reporting back, and the chief engineer for this was a guy we'll talk about a little bit later, but Edward Gay. I have a bit of a bromance going with Edward Gay. He's a very under-known engineer, but he really did some marvelous things for Pennsylvania, resident of Lancaster for a long time as well. Now, okay, let's just, I think we should just, this is getting too distracting for me, I'm sorry. So, yes ma'am?
What happened to the property rights of the people who owned the land?
Property rights of people who were impacted by, sometimes they were ignored, frankly, sometimes they were compensated, and other times there were lawsuits that came up where they had to get things settled in court. So it was indeed messy, that's for sure. All right, so at the Wrightsville end of the Susquehanna Tidewater, you would come to, you saw that canal basin with all the canals waiting, and where were they going then from there? Well, they would be crossing the Susquehanna River. Well, how do you cross the Susquehanna River with mules? Well, there was a bridge there. Do you remember the bridge that got burned in the Civil War? That was a covered bridge, but on the downstream side of that bridge, there was a two-level deck where the mule teams would be traveling, one on the lower deck to go one way, one on the upper deck. This thing was a mile long. You couldn't wait for somebody to make it the whole way. So these boats were going back and forth, being pulled by these mules on this special deck. And it was just amazing to ponder. There was also a canal basin down at Havertide near the Lock House, and the towpath was all the way out into the Susquehanna River. So if you can just imagine these, mules walking on this little levee that was built in the middle of the, not middle, but in the Tidewater, it was just a stunning thing. All right, anybody go to the shore down in Delaware? Okay, anybody go to Delaware? Anybody go to Virginia? All right, if you've done any of those things, you've crossed over the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. When we go down from time to time, we're going over this beautiful bridge, those golden strand cables that hold the bridge up. Well, when you're doing that, you're going over the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. I never knew that. Here I am, civil engineer. But this thing was built in the early 1820s. And it still exists. It's still in use. It's this massive artificial waterway that connects the Chesapeake Bay to the Delaware River. If you can imagine somebody going from Baltimore to Philadelphia, naturally they would have to go down the Chesapeake Bay, around and back up. So that's 300 and some odd miles to get back up to Philadelphia. Well, they said, hey, why don't we just shortcut it? So they built in 1824 to 1829, 66-foot wide, 10 feet deep. It only had 4 locks. But remember I was talking about feeder streams? You got to get water into this thing. So it's dead flat out there. So how are you going to get streams flowing to where this canal is? They built steam engines to push the water up into these locks at the top. It's kind of similar to the way the Panama Canal was created, where they have this big lake in the middle and the water flows out of it artificially. Same thing. And then the U.S. government took it over in 1919. They said, no, we're not keeping those locks. We're yanking the locks out. We're widening this thing. So it's super wide now, hence the big, tall bridge you have to use to get over it. But it really is stunning. Now, the Conestoga navigation, as Ken was mentioning, and Don and I have spoken about, this was a really interesting. I'm going to drag this out now, since we're
Picture this.
all right. So the Conestoga navigation, it was a slackwater navigation. So what that means is that they dammed the entire river in 9 different locations. That's all the way across. It wasn't a separately excavated channel. They dammed the whole river, and they made the river go slack. That's why it's called the slack water navigation. So there were these pools, step pools, behind each of these dams, and then a lock at each of the dams. 9 locations. It turned out to be a huge mistake from a maintenance standpoint, but remember, we wanted to build it fast, we wanted to build it cheap, bring all this commerce coming in from the 1820s, get it into Lancaster. It just didn't work out for that at all. But there are a couple locations. This is lock number 8. This still exists today down in Safe Harbor Park. It's behind a cyclone fence. But you look at it and you say, that's so freaking far away from the river, right? Well, the thing is that river, here it is. Yeah, so this is a 3D model that shows the dam built, and it raises that elevation of the water in the Conestoga River and gets the water to that lock so you can take a boat over there. So that water was 12 to 15 feet higher than it is today. So stunning thing that was done in the Conestoga navigation. Chief engineer for that, Edward Gay. All right, my buddy. All right, so there's this great profile that shows, all right, if this thing is not going to be a screen, I'm going to draw on it. All right, so we've got, no ink. All right.
Give it a shake, don't give up. Give it a shake.
All right, so this is,
Doing a good job.
yes, this is Pittsburgh. Here's Philadelphia. Now you got to think like an engineer. Dad, you with me? All right, any other engineers in the house? Yes, great, great. Oh my gosh, this is terrific. Plan and profiles, right? Plan and profiles. So this is base ground elevation. And Philadelphia is here, then we're going to draw up like taking a slice through a cake. So we've got some stuff going on here, and then we've got the Susquehanna River, and then we come out here, the elevation of the earth is changing, and then we got the Alleghenies, okay? So how in the world are you going to get a canal boat up over the Alleghenies? Well, what they did is they built this inclined planes where you would, see, that's the mountain here, and you would draw the canal out of the water, pull it up, and then send it on its way. And then you go up to the next inclined plane and pull it up over there. So they had 10 of these inclined planes, 5 of them going up and 5 of them going down. The inclined planes, that was a total distance, I'm sorry, really struggling here. Yeah, so they pulled the Portage Railroad, pulled the boats up and over. There were various sections of railway to take it from one inclined plane to the next. There was a 900-foot tunnel that still exists today, one of the longest tunnels that was built at its time. Now, early 1800s, right? How in the world are you going to pull these things up? Well, they did have a few steam locomotives, but they were fixed position. They were stationary. So they were pulling with enormous power these boats up and out of the water, and then letting them down the other side. They would counterweight it with another boat going in the other direction to offset the amount of energy. But the pulling was achieved through a hemp rope. And this hemp rope was roughly 3.5 inches in diameter. And then this other engineer came along and he said, you know, I'm doing my best German, you know, you really should consider using a wire cable here. Anybody know who that was?
Roebling.
Roebling, very good. Which Roebling? John, very good. So John then went on to build bridges, and most famously the
Brooklyn
Brooklyn
Bridge.
Bridge. Okay, y'all already know all this. So amazing that John Roebling was involved in the Allegheny Portage as an engineer. A lot of these engineers, they did not go to Lehigh like I did. They did not go to Virginia Military Institute like my dad, or MIT. There wasn't such a thing. The earliest civil engineering training was offered by West Point, and that was in around 1802. RPI up in Troy began right around the time of these canal era started. So the canals really led to the whole development of the civil engineering profession. So John Roebling was involved in the Portage Railroad. Another buddy of mine, anybody want to guess his name? Edward Gay? Yeah, that's right. He was involved in the Portage Railroad. He designed this whole canal basin, and they named the borough after him, Gaysport. So Gaysport was then annexed into Hollidaysburg. So if you go to Hollidaysburg, you'll still see it there. You'll still see some of the vestiges. There's a park you can go check out with some neat little canal-oriented attractions. Wonderful pictures of the inclined planes. I'm so sorry.
Can you just hold them up? Can you hold
No,
them up?
it's really, all right. So back to other engineers. One of the earliest engineers to be involved in Pennsylvania canals was Benjamin Latrobe. You might understand you might recognize that name as an architect, a painter. He was also a surveyor and a civil engineer. He was involved in blasting out the bed of the Susquehanna River to open up a channel, a navigable channel. He also created this marvelous map that Don photographed. It's on display at the Zimmerman Center, Susquehanna National Heritage Area. So I would encourage you to go and check that out. We're going to pause just a second. Yes, Julie.
Can I just tell if there's an actual fascinating book in Millersville University on this one. They started out with all their friends in Philadelphia and Baltimore saying, here, buy stock, and they would give them stock. And then they ran out of people to ask money from, so they actually went to Europe, and they got the state of Maryland to guarantee the bonds, and they actually started selling stock in Europe.
Cool. Yeah. I'm going to keep scooting forward here.
Sorry.
That's okay. So speaking of Philadelphia, in the early 1820s, right around the time the Erie Canal opened up, there was a group of private businessmen and professionals in Philadelphia who formed the PA Improvement Society. I love that, the Pennsylvania Improvement Society. And they sent William Strickland over to England and said, learn all about canals, and come back and bring sketches and information, and come back and teach us all how to do it so we don't have to hire engineers. Yeah, that went well. But William came back and he said, you know, folks, everybody in England is saying, don't build canals, build railroads. And he came back with that suggestion, wasn't listened to, because people wanted to do what was working up in New York, in the Erie Canal. Okay, so that's the PA Improvement Society. Some of the other, I mentioned about the labor force and the terrible working conditions that were for those folks, but they did come up with some ingenious types of devices. One picture that I wanted to show you was a stump puller. So you have these stumps that, you know, everywhere you're going to have stumps that have to be pulled out. And they created these big wheeled devices. So this wheel would go across, and then there was another pulley here with a mule team that would be driving this, and it would be pulling the stumps literally out of the ground. So this wonderful picture that shows this thing, it's probably 3 times the height of a person to then have that leverage and to be able to maneuver this thing all along the canal worksite. Some of the, yes ma'am?
As far as people who worked to build the canals, was this something where a lot of immigrants were brought in to do this work?
They weren't brought in, they were already here. But this was work that was available for the immigrant labor force that was here. It was plentiful. They were willing to just trust that they would be paid. It was better than trying to scrape together what they could elsewhere. Unfortunately, a lot of those folks were taken advantage of. Like I said, the living conditions were horrendous. The working conditions were terrible. a lot of disease, a lot of injuries, and guess what? On top of all that, their wages were deferred. So they'd have to wait a couple months or a year to get paid. Just terrible. Meanwhile, the engineers were well taken care of, thank you very much. These guys were, they were being paid like $3,000 a year, and they would move around from project to project. Ephraim Beach, Simeon Guilford, and many others. I mentioned John Roebling as well, Benjamin White, Canvas Wright. They just did incredible things all throughout these various projects. Now, I did want to touch base on Edward Gay a little bit more. Edward Gay, as I mentioned, came to Lancaster and worked on the Conestoga navigation. He had been working on Erie Canal, was born in New York City. He came to Lancaster, worked on the project here for a little while, saw it through its conclusion in the late 1820s. But then he went on to work on the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal. He worked, as I said, on the Portage Railroad and the Juniata River Canal that connected to the Portage Railroad. He ultimately was hired as the state engineer for the canal commissioners. He had a good friend in a young fellow here in Lancaster by the name of James Buchanan, I think. So there's some record of correspondence between the two of them, especially when Edward was between gigs, if you will. He was trying to find his next position. He became president of the Philadelphia and Erie Railroad, and I learned where he died in West Philadelphia, the house where he lived. My daughter-in-law did some genealogy report, study, and she learned about that his first wife died, and then, as was common practice, he married the sister of his first wife. And then they had several children. Three of the sons were killed during the Civil War. The other son died soon after. They had a daughter as well, but she died during childbirth, and that child did not survive. So I thought, oh, isn't this interesting? I find that there's this I know where the graveyard is, where he's been buried. I think I'll just go down. And so I go down to this massive graveyard in West Philadelphia. It's a beautiful day. People are walking their dogs and running and jogging. It's almost like a park. But I'm hoping to find somebody who can help me with where the location of Edward Gay's gravesite is. Nobody to be found. No docents, no information center, no map, nothing online. So I'm like, okay, well, it's a nice day. I'm just going to go for a walk. And it's amazing where I parked my car and where I walked just randomly. I couldn't have walked in a more direct line to Edward Gay's gravesite. It took me 8 minutes to get there. I'm looking around, but then it was in a straight line. It's like he said, Ben, you're the only person who's ever looked for me. So it's been pretty amazing to think about, the engineering that's involved. Here I'm the township engineer for Lancaster Township. 7 years ago, I had never given any thought to what the name of the road, Second Lock Road, in Lancaster Township meant. I never gave it any thought. I didn't give a rip about local history. And now, I can't get enough. Apologies to my wife. But it is a real passion of mine. I love it, and so glad everybody came out to talk about Canal Engineering. So thank you. I will work through the PowerPoint problems and got on the other side. So let's throw it open for some questions. Yes, sir.
When was the last canal used here in Lancaster?
So the Lancaster Canal that we're referring to would be the Conestoga navigation, which basically fell apart right after the Civil War. So late 1850s. Late 1850s? Okay. that answer your question?
Yeah, are they still building canals anywhere today?
Yes, there's still canals being used. The Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, sections of the Erie Canal are used for recreation. There's also the National Canal Museum that's in near
Easton.
Easton. Thank you. Yeah, near Easton, and you can go on a little boat ride that's pulled by mules. I wouldn't call it a canal boat, but it's evocative. So yes, ma'am.
What size boats were on that canal in the Conestoga? What size did they ever manage to get down?
So they were all constrained by the locks, right?
Yeah, and
Because
they
there
all
were
look
other
very
places-
small, yeah.
There were other places where there were dams on the Conestoga, and much larger vessels could go up and down. The Lady Gay steamship
Yeah,
paddle wheel boat that went from Bridgeport down to Rocky Springs, so that was a much larger
okay.
boat.
But it
But
never went
typically the
over.
canal boats were 65 feet long,
Really?
16 feet wide, and 8 feet deep. Yes, ma'am.
And did they make it to the Susquehanna?
Sure. Yes, ma'am.
I live on the last strong bend just below Slackwater, and it baffles my mind the way that S-curve is right before, how they could ever get, you say 65 feet?
65 feet long. Yes,
How,
ma'am.
and they must have been hitting the bank on one side and, and.
Certainly.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
You gotta remember, the water was 12 to 15 feet
Well,
higher than
it's,
it is.
yeah, well, it was 5
And so
feet
when it
higher
was-
when we lived there. It dropped 5 feet after they took Rock Hill down.
So that water
Yeah.
being that much higher, it was
Yeah.
that much wider.
So,
And there was
yeah,
an improved
so-
towpath that was
Okay,
built
yeah, yeah,
all along the way.
okay, because it
Now,
all,
right at Slackwater, there was a later addition of a more conventional canal
Uh-huh.
built out of the bed of the Conestoga River.
yeah, you
So,
can kind of
think there are a
still
couple
see
other
that at
questions?
Sac.
Yes, Ed?
Yeah.
The
65
incline system you have here, is that similar to, or was it based on the way that they transport the riverboats in Europe, especially across Germany, when they're going from, say, Amsterdam all the way down to Budapest, where they have to go up those mountains?
I suppose so. I think they have more modern technology than the
I'm sure it's
incline
more
planes.
modern, yeah, but it's.
Yeah, but it was back then, the incline planes were based off of a mining operation
Mhm.
to get ore up and down.
Right.
Because hemp ropes and mining ore, if it breaks, everything comes sliding down. You put people on this thing, you know, it gets pretty scary. And there were accidents at the Portage Railroad where the rope would break. They only lasted 60 months. The hemp rope would break, and so they installed different safety measures to catch and stop breaks, if you will. I'm sorry?
Use the wire ones.
Right, ultimately. So they're, yes, sir.
Now, these boats were pretty heavy. How many mules pulled that?
2 or 3.
Well, that was it.
Yeah. I mean, once you got it started, it was pretty easy to keep going along. Yes, sir. Jay?
I got a couple questions, and two of them are easy. You mentioned Lancaster Telegraph. What year was that?
1846, I think.
And what year do you think they went across the Susquehanna? The earliest I could find around 1875.
The earliest of what went across
The
the...
telegraph.
Oh, that I don't know. I'm sorry.
The second question, do you know where Edward Gady's office was in Lancaster?
I don't. Do you?
No.
He was ready to play.
Don't build me up like that. Oh, man. I've been looking for his office, his house, anything.
I think I have it.
I don't know if
You think you have it,
I
Julie?
think I have it. I'll send it to you. I have an ad for when they were doing the contracts, and it's like, send your contract to this address.
So this address, you sure it's an address?
Yes, I'll find it. I'll send it.
All right, Julie, thank you. That'd be great.
One more question.
Yes.
This is gonna be a tough one. On all the locks, with the gates, the pointing stone on top and except the hill post of the miter gate, they're all the same except for Lapman, lock 9. The north end of it, it's square. So my question is, did they ever have a lift gate? We can't figure out how the gate would have worked in a square
There were some lift gates, and there's also a guillotine gate, but I don't know the specifics of the lock at Aladdin.
Yeah, the north end of it, instead of having the round out thing for the gate, it's a square thing there. It has rock underneath it.
Okay.
Like something would have set there, it might have been a lift gate or something.
Yeah. Yes, sir, in the back.
If you want a canal museum closer by, the Easter Museum north of Reading, Pennsylvania, is quite good.
Easter?
Easter, H-I-E-S-T-E-R.
The Easter.
And at that same location, there's the River Wagon Works, which is well worth a visit.
Okay.
And if you run out of things to do, the Mid-Atlantic Air Museum is on the other side of the highway.
Okay. Heading up that way soon, Louis?
I'm actually heading out next weekend to Hollidaysburg, actually, that you mentioned.
All right,
So
good.
I've been to the actual Allegheny Portage Railroad twice already, but unfortunately, I kept having a problem with my FD card, so I have no footage of it. So now I get to go to a third time to go do it.
Technical difficulties everywhere, right?
Mhm.
Yes, ma'am.
When you go through the Panama Canal, they have these tractor sort of things that pull the boats, and they call them mules.
Okay, good. Yes, sir. Yes, Carl.
To what extent, if any, did the boats and the mule teams work at night? And if so, how did they get this done?
I don't know to what extent, but I have seen pictures of essentially headlights on the lanterns on the front of a canal boat with sort of three shield mirror, so projecting light forward. I don't know if that was used a lot, but that was one means of providing illumination. Yes, sir.
Do we know why they switched the Susquehanna Tidewater to the western side?
No, I don't, but Julie does.
I'm sorry. So, two reasons. One, they tried to buy the rights to the western canal. First of all, the eastern canal, the original canal was way too small. And then when it gets up to the Pennsylvania state line, it's rock. So first they tried to buy the rights to that, and they were negotiating, and the Maryland Canal people were just being really greedy and giving them ridiculous numbers. Meanwhile, Gay does the survey on the western side and said, it's going to be so much cheaper to buy on the western side, even if they give it to you, it wouldn't be worth it. So they went on the western side.
Gay's advice was listened to. Yes, Craig.
Any information on the double lock of the Falmouth?
I haven't studied that part of the canal system, but
Um,
I'm sure it's out there.
I was interested you said that because I was out there last week with the two gentlemen that I was talking to you about. And from what I understand, the side closest to the railroad track was actually used to, when they needed to service the town, the lock would dock there and they would take off the goods on that side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a little port.
Yeah, it was like a little
Yeah.
separate port. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. The state archives has a massive amount of information all about canals, and happened to come across the guy who's in charge of the record set, Kurt Bell, and he's got all kinds of information about canals. So there is stuff online. Other questions? Let me see. Yes, sir.
I understand that at Philadelphia and at Columbia, there were inclines to get from the canal up to that railroad that you mentioned. Is there anything left of it to see?
That I don't know. I'm sorry. Possibly, but I don't know the answer.
That's Plain Street in Columbia.
Yeah,
A street named Plain Street, but I don't think there's anything there to recognize.
I didn't see anyone I drove up that street.
Yeah, I've also not been able to find a whole lot of good specific site information about the inclined plane into Columbia. But yes, Ken.
There's a large lantern that is on display with our canal exhibit at the Canal Area Historical Society. That supposedly was a night light for a canal boat.
Okay, so that's that trifold lantern thing we're talking about, the headlamps. Yes, ma'am.
When they're ported in the boat, what surface is it on?
So it's a railroad. So it's
Oh, so it's got they're
right. So they drop this little trolley, not trolley, whatever carriage you want to call it. They put that down into the river, and then they bring that canal boat up onto it, and then start to pull it up, and then the next one comes on. But sometimes these canal boats were actually sectional, so that you could take them apart and send them up and over that way, because 65 feet long, that's all fine and good, but then when you get to the top, then, so it got to be sort of tricky. Yes?
Tidewater basins, you raise the water expands out. Do they still use a tow path with mules, or do they pull their canals across?
So the canal basins, not necessarily tidewater, but the canal basins is what you're asking about. And I think there were tugs that were also offered to be able to maneuver around without the use of mules on the land side. There was a cool diagram that Lockhouse Museum has that shows a horse-powered tug where there's a turntable inside the flat bottom of the tug, and they would put a horse going this way, a mule going this way, a mule going this way, and they would just walk, and they would turn this wooden wheel inside the tug that would then drive the paddle wheel boat prior to steam engines doing that. So I'm glad some of you followed my hand gyrations. It blew my mind when I saw it. You trying to remember where that is?
No, I realize.
Okay.
I think there's a 6 horsepower one sunk up in Lake Champlain someplace.
Okay.
The Erie Canal, for coals, they used waylocks. Were they pretty common on all the other canals? Or?
I'm pretty sure that every canal system had a waylock somewhere. Some way of measuring the amount of cargo that you had, and then they had different rates that will apply to the poundage of cargo that you would have. If I recall, at the beginning of every year, you were assigned, you were weighed empty, and then you were assigned what your empty weight was, and then that was subtracted as a tare off of your loaded amount at the waylock. I'm sure nobody ever messed with those tare weights. Yes, sir.
Just to follow up, you know, I know they used to carry coal and iron ore up and down the canal, so like what kind of weight was in one of those canal boats if it was filled with iron ore or coal?
I don't know. Does anyone else know a typical weight? Yes, sir.
Typically, I think they're around about 100 tons, except I think it was the Schuylkill Canal, I believe it was the one that was enlarged, and they carried as much as 200 tons.
I mean, that's a lot considering, you know, you can only get like 40 tons on a semi.
Yeah, well.
So it is what it is. Perhaps there's better information. Let's not argue about it. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Why was the Erie Canal such a financial success while the Pennsylvanians struggled?
I believe it was primarily because it was so, what's the right word? It was so well thought out and so fortuitous that they had the Mohawk Valley that they could go through. So the Alleghenies are an extension of the Appalachians. The Appalachians work their way up through, and they cross through New York State as well. But the New York State Canal, the Erie Canal, didn't have to punch through or up and over the Alleghenies the way that we had to in Pennsylvania. It had the Mohawk Valley. It had feeder streams coming through. Here's a mind-blowing idea. When they were first, the canal commissioners in 1824 were first looking at going from Chester and Lancaster counties to the Susquehanna, they were thinking of going through Gap, PA, until they realized there's no way to get water into it without tearing down that whole mountain. So the Mohawk Valley was a real winner. Governor Clinton at the time, DeWitt Clinton, was under a great amount of stress to both build it and people saying it'll never work. It's going to be an utter disaster. But
access the Great Lakes.
I'm sorry?
It accessed the Great Lakes.
Accessed the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, so everybody wanted to go. It was go that route. It was also one of the first ones to be open, to open that conveyance. You also got to remember the competing interests of the states were very different than the competing interests of the states today. And also the competing interests of Philadelphia versus New York. You know, which one's larger, which one's more prominent. Right after the Revolutionary War, Philadelphia really saw a lot of growth and was very prominent, more prominent than New York City. But then once the Erie Canal opened up, then you need to go up the Hudson to Albany to get the canal to get over. Otherwise, you're slogging your way through. To go from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, prior to the canal system opening up, it took 23 days. Once it opened up, it took 6. So cargo, commerce, people, transportation, communication, all those things pushing westward, 23 days to 6. It just opened it up completely. So more questions or comments? Love this. Thank you so much, everybody. This has been great.
Usually when I